Hello, I'm Rob and I'm on my 8th week of placement as a student dietitian. So it was Wednesday today and this is my last but one day in Royal Glamorgan Hospital, so it's kind of coming to the end of one of the sections now. It was a very different day today, so I've had my halfway review with my lecturer. Really nice to catch up because we've not seen a lot of the lecturers for quite some time, with the university not doing any face-to-face lectures, and just whilst I was on placement as well, we're very much sent into the NHS, into the world of work, so it's very much on-site learning, it's not classroom based anymore. So yeah, nice to catch up, lots of positive stuff to report back. I've had really nice time, all the teams have been lovely, so yeah, a positive experience all round so far. And then as I said yesterday, next week off to Ysbyty Cymru for my last section. Anyway, so today I was with the critical care dietitian, a role I didn't know existed until I went to Royal Glamorgan Hospital. I had a rough idea that dietitians were involved somewhere with critical care, but I didn't know that there was a specific role. And it sounds like it's a role that's being invested in more, and I know the dietitian who works there is hoping to have a full-time position created soon, and to see more investment for dietitians in critical care. So what does a critical care dietitian do, I hear you ask? Well, I was provided with a lot of literature to get through in the morning and a workbook which would kind of indicate some of the areas for research and the areas that need to be considered for a dietitian's practice in critical care. So when I talk about critical care, I'm referring to either intensive care, which is the kind of the highest level of medical treatment someone can receive, or there's HDU, which is high dependency unit, which is kind of like the next level down. So people will go from one to the other if they're making a positive recovery. Intensive care tends to be one-to-one nursing, so there'll be one nurse for each patient, and that's purely due to the frequency of observations they're receiving and the amount of observation machines the patient's got on as well. So one of the little tasks I had to do was looking at how we observe almost every organ in the body. We have technology to do that now, so there's EEG, which is like an electrograph for brain activity. So familiar with ECG, which you see in TV programs all the time, so that's tracking the electrical activity of the heart. We've got pulse oximetry that can measure oxygen in the blood. There's also arterial blood gases which can do that, and look at different types of blood gases as well. We can measure kidney function, and we've also obviously got catheter bags to watch for fluid output, which is particularly important for dietitians. There's all the different feeding routes then we'd be using in intensive care as well. So some patients may be managing food orally, some may be sedated and therefore they may require an NG. And the differences for feeding rates can vary as well, because these patients are typically not mobile at all, they're not moving about, so their physical activity levels are reduced, so that reduces their needs. I believe the dietitians said they tend to use 20 to 25 calories per kilogram, but there's a lot of literature out there looking at different amounts. And something I was unfamiliar with is when someone goes into that very acute stage of being unwell, when they're admitted to intensive care, there's something called an ebb and flow stage where the body is in an anabolic and catabolic state depending on how far into the illness they are. And it doesn't sound like we do that practically yet at RGH, but there is research out there that indicates we could take this into account with feeding regimes. But I'm noticing this, that there may be studies and evidence-based suggesting things, but what's practically done can be different, and I think that's the importance of talking to someone who works in the field to say, yes, there's evidence to suggest certain things, but also then there are areas perhaps outside of dietetics where we need to take consideration of that as well, of what can be practically done, or what's best when we consider all different aspects of the patient's care. What I wanted to highlight, I found particularly useful, and I hadn't appreciated how good this resource was. So it's the S-Pen guidance. It's the European Society of Parenteral and Enteral Nutrition, so ESPEN. look them up. They've got all of their data accessible for free, and there's ones on critical care, and the other one I've been looking at in detail a lot recently was the liver disease guidance as well. So they perhaps have some of the more up-to-date guidance, and it's really in detail. Looks at all the studies that have come out, up to a point since 2000. I think they said they tried to look at, because data and studies designed after that period tended to be more accurate, and they pose questions throughout the analysis of what would be the best protein intake for an obese patient in intensive care. Really, really specific guidance, and it seems protein intakes is one of the very variable areas where we can make some alterations, and there are potential consequences, both positive and negative, that can affect that. So yeah, loads and loads of detail. It can be a little bit overwhelming, I think, if you're if you're into nutrition or dietetics and you're just starting out. Reading some of these might seem quite over the top in terms of the knowledge level you need to get to employ it, but I can see that once you go into practice and you're a student on placement, it starts to make more sense, and you can actually start to utilise some of this in your practice. So yeah, great resources. And in line of that then as well, there's Aspen. If you just Google Aspen, you get a lot of holiday information up. So it's the American Association for Parenteral and Enteral Nutrition, but their website's something like nutritionresource.org, I think. Don't quote me on that, but if you type in the full acronym, you should get that up. And they in particular have a lot of information about obese patients, because obviously there's a massive prevalence of obesity over there. In terms of the research, obviously America's got a very different healthcare system to us, so I'd be interested to see the reasons behind, because there's more money in it, are they able to conduct more in-depth research? I'm not sure, but different guidance there. From what I saw on the websites, a lot of that looks a little bit older. Aspen seems to be more up to date, at least for the critical care. So yeah, check them out first if you do have time to look at one. And then after reading through everything, I had a chat with the dietitian who works there, and she just gave me an insight of the systems they use. Really nice to see. One of my bugbears of working on the wards at the moment is still everything is on paper. You can see biochemistry and some GP history stuff online, but for the day-to-day update of what's going on with a patient, you need to head down to the ward and look through the paper notes. So the intensive care and high dependency unit system is all online, and it's a joy to look at. So everything's organised via the different types of clinicians that would be involved in the department. You can see their notes. There's different layouts for everyone, so I really hope they'd implement a similar system across the whole of the hospital. I know the NHS is trying to do this. It'd be nice if they could do it by the time I'm kind of starting our careers from this year. Fingers crossed. It is going to make a big difference to patient care, I think, and the time it takes to do stuff as well is going to be a big difference. So yeah, going through everything, we could see all of the patients' OBS, and they can have hourly slots. So when someone is intensive care, the amount of input that they're receiving is massive. You can see why it requires so much one-to-one time with a nurse, and then they'll have healthcare assistants on there, they'll have speech and language therapists, they'll have physios. Didn't appreciate how much the physios do. Really important for managing the airway. What else did we see as well? So they've got the team just turning the patient, simple things like that. Obviously when someone's been sedated, which potentially happen in intensive care, they're not moving them themselves, and if we're lying on the same part of our body for a long time, you can start to develop pressure sores, which is quite an important consideration for dietetic practice as well. So you can see on the system how they've recorded it that I'm not sure if it does every half an hour, every couple of hours, but they're turning the patient from one side to the other. So yeah, it's just these tiny little things, looking after their mouth care, because you're not swallowing, so you might have to wet your lips and inside your mouth, or putting Vaseline on the lips to keep them moist, stop them getting cracked. Looking after their bowels as well, because obviously you're not getting up to go to the loo. Yeah, absolutely everything's looked after. And something else we talked about, which was really, really interesting, to kind of an inside view, was obviously intensive care has had an interesting time with COVID, because the amount of patients who have ended up on a ventilator, ended up in the department, the dietitian was telling me that it seemed that it got to one point, I think this possibly before some of the treatments came out that we now have, that once someone was ventilated, their chances of survival were 50-50. So it shows, you know, how severe this disease is, and despite all of the medical marvels that we've got, and I could see how in-depth the analysis that they're receiving was, that still, you know, there are diseases out there that once you become so poorly, there's only so much we can do. So it gave me an appreciation for the tough time the hospital has gone through. I mean, it seems that, you know, they've got a lot more capacity there now. It's not as full as it was, and that's, you know, that's representative across the whole hospital. But yeah, it just really put it in perspective. And, you know, I think when you see stories on the news about, like, oh, it's not real, or it's not that bad, and then you hear the stories from people working really, really on the front line, you know, dealing with the worst case scenarios of it, that yeah, it's pretty severe. But, you know, really interesting to hear about, and it's kind of a privilege to get to talk to this dietitian. I think we're doing a audit tomorrow. I think it's still up in the air as to what the team thinks will be the most appropriate thing, so I'll let you know what the last day in Royal Glamorgan Hospital brings tomorrow. But that's it from this evening. So thanks for listening. Cheerio.